This week's update to the War Within beta brought several big rounds of changes. We've got changes to Mythic Plus affixes, we've got class changes, we've got tank changes, and there's even one tiny sounding change that is something I've been requesting for many years. So, this is a really good weekly update. Let's dive in, but before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us make more content like this, more guides, and helps the channel continue to grow. Alright, let's go ahead and start with those Mythic Plus changes, and I'm just going to start right here at the top of the post by Kaivax from earlier today. And here it is. Greetings, Dungeoneers. This week's beta update includes major changes to the Mythic Keystone Affix System in the War Within based on player feedback. This is all true. Our primary goal with these updates is to refine the Mythic Plus experience to serve a diverse player base better. Previously, we approached Mythic Keystones with a one-size-fits-all approach, which proved challenging in striking the right balance and limited our design space. In this new build, you will see significant shifts in our design philosophy. We recognize the importance of weekly variety for those progressing through the system. However, for players pushing high keys, this variance has sometimes felt restrictive. We heard your feedback about wanting affixes with both positive and negative effects, as well as a desire for thematic nods similar to past affixes. All of this sounds good so far, and I'm happy to jump ahead and say it is good so far. This update of the affix system aims to meet those diverse expectations. We're maintaining the core goals of our last round of changes, but without the limitations of the one-size-fits-all approach. This flexibility allows us to craft a more tailored experience for each of the different playstyles, so let's dive in. Okay, this is really, this is where things get good. They are removing Sanguine, Bolstering, Raging, and Bursting. Now you'll note that they're not saying War Within Season 1, they're just saying War Within. I think they're basically, quote unquote, retiring these forever, retiring them to death. And those affixes are Sanguine, Bolstering, Raging, and Bursting. Now Raging and Bursting, whatever, but Sanguine and Bolstering being just murdered forever, dead and gone, no one will miss them. It is glorious that those are both going away. I remember once upon a time, Sanguine was not viewed with the same level of hatred that it has right now. I think that's probably because older affixes were even worse. Maybe dungeon design was a little less claustrophobic, maybe some mixture of the two, but Sanguine has definitely become something that players really have come to hate in recent years, and nobody's gonna miss this one. Additionally, the 4 new affixes that they were planning to put in as of last round of Mythic Plus testing, Reckless, Focused, Attuned, and Thorned, that would make monsters do a little bit of something else, sorta, but it was kind of tuned to whether or not they had mana, and then it would basically make them take more of one type of damage, nature damage or fire damage, and it kind of really left Enhancement Shaman and a handful of specs kind of out in the lurch, and just really wasn't very fun or well communicated to players. That's just gone entirely. Good. Again, 2 good things that need to go. I didn't really think that these affixes were terrible in the annoying, inconvenient way that Sanguine and Bolstering can be, but they definitely didn't feel like a good design that should be carried forward. And they're not going to be, thankfully. Instead, what they're going with is they're going to bring back a seasonal affix in the form of this Xalatath affix, which I have played around with just very briefly in a +3, and it is pretty interesting. There are 2 versions of it that will rotate on a weekly basis, and so we'll just start with that. Xalatath's Bargain Ascendant is a bonus that periodically throughout combat, this is probably the same sort of design as we've had from effects like Incorporeal that will spawn potentially every 30 seconds, but guaranteed every minute while you're in combat. That would be my guess from just playing around with it very briefly. While in combat, Xalatath will rain down orbs of cosmic energy that attempt to empower nearby enemies, increasing their haste and movement speed. If players disrupt these orbs, then they claim this effect for themselves. Now, the way that this actually works is it gives enemies a very large stacking haste and move speed buff if those orbs go off, and this is very similar to Razageth orbs, where you have to crowd control them in some way. And so the sort of crowd control skills like Ring of Peace, things that kind of exist and persist, can be pretty good for throwing those down as soon as these orbs come out. They sort of don't all spawn all at once, and you'll definitely be able to see that in the footage. There's a little bit of a delay of them coming out and kind of cascading out, but they're pretty close together. It's not like you could interrupt one and then interrupt a second one. They're definitely not up for 15 seconds to interrupt. You have probably 6 seconds or so to really get all of them from the time the first one starts spawning and then the final one has spawned, and then, that first one's going to finish its cast. There's a small amount of delay, but not much. So AoE crowd controls become really, really valuable here. The difference for the bonus between players getting the haste and move speed or enemies getting the haste and move speed is I think it's something like 20% or maybe 10% haste and move speed for enemies. And for players, it's 1% per orb. And you can get up to 20% haste and move speed, which is not bad. It's pretty close to a Bloodlust on a 1-minute cooldown. That's pretty good. Very useful to have more move speed. I think for the majority of specs in the game, getting haste feels good and is useful. Even for some of the specs like Windwalker Monk, where it has historically not been very good, Blizzard has gone out of their way with the class design and the talent tree to make it at least be a little bit more useful. That isn't the case for Brewmaster Monk yet. That is, I think, about the only spec I can really think of that truly has no value for haste right now, but, maybe that'll change. The other affix that changes, that is a +2 affix, is Zalatas Bargain Frenzied, which just makes it so that enemies at 30% basically get a version of the old Raging, where they do not really more damage. They get 40% more haste, which doesn't necessarily correlate to more damage. It correlates to more damage and auto attacks on the tank. If it is an enemy that kind of spam casts in different directions on people in the party, that could be more damage, especially if they do like uninterruptible AoE damage, channel skills, that sort of thing. That could wind up being more damage, but generally speaking, they sort of get a Bloodlust, and then they also take a lot more damage, 20% more when they're below 30%. So this is actually pretty good for any sort of execute classes. Anybody who's good at like cryo damage really gets a big bonus out of this. They get more execute damage during that big execute window. I think that's pretty nice. The only like class that I feel like, again, kind of gets left out in the lurch here would be monks with Touch of Death. That multiplied, like that 20% multiplicative damage increase isn't going to do anything for your Touch of Death. So monks are maybe like the one class that kind of gets left behind by these two +2 effects. But I think for the majority of classes, for the majority of specs, this is all pretty good, and it's pretty unilaterally good. Like, this is about as good for a Shadow Priest as it is for an Arms Warrior, as it is for, a Balanced Druid. At level 7, a new affix, Challenger's Peril, just affects the timer. Basically, when you're doing +7s, dying will subtract 15 seconds rather than 5. That's it. That's the entirety of the +7 mechanic. That is a pretty good way to punish players and make bad decisions be a lot more impactful. Deaths, bad play, mistakes, however you want to phrase it, that kind of thing becomes a lot more impactful at higher levels. That's good. It makes the game more impactful and more exacting for mistakes, more punishing as people get to higher levels, but it doesn't do the annoying thing that like Sanguine or Incorporeal do, where they're occupying a lot of mental space and basically overriding the design space that should be allocated to the monsters in the dungeon. So I do think that's a pretty good affix. I actually like this one. Just straight up, I think it's good. This is almost the same as no affix, but just the game is harder, and that's exactly how they should be working. Finally, at +12, you get a new affix called Zalatas Guile, which just removes these initial Zalatas Bargain, Kiss, Curse affixes entirely, and just gives you a negative affix. It just gives you 20% more monster health and damage. This is a way for Blizzard to just make it so that the higher you scale your key, the more damage it deals, the more dangerous it is, and really just opens up a lot more design space for high-level players to engage with the mechanics of the dungeon and not even really think about like affixes. So I think on the one hand, this is something that'll probably like not be so great for the MDI or whatever. There's not any affixes interacting. I think a lot of those players will probably be much happier with this. I don't know, I could be wrong. Definitely doesn't impact me though. I will say that like, I think this is cool. I think that Kiss Curse stuff is very cool at the +2 level. I think that's great. I think the incredible level of simplicity of Challenger's Peril, this +7 level, is also pretty good. And ultimately, I think like the fact that they have this +12 modifier that just makes it so that the +2 Kiss Curse goes away entirely and it's just all downside for high level pushers. I think that's, for those people who are addicted to that pain, I think that's actually a good thing. And it really just makes it so that there are kind of two different levels of dungeon, of Mythic Plus dungeon that exist. There are ones with the Kiss Curse, ones with some difficulty from Challenger's Peril, and then ones that are just all completely pain for the sickos who really, really love to push keys and really like it to be nice and difficult. And then we have Fortified and Tyrannical, and this is where they're like, putting peas in the guacamole. They just kind of can't help themselves. Instead of just having Fortified and Tyrannical continue to be on a rotation, they're now going to be in all +10 keys. You have Fortified or Tyrannical being the +4 modifier, and then Tyrannical or Fortified being the +10 modifier. So once you push up into the kind of top end of the reward structure of Mythic Plus, doing a +10 or higher, you are always going to have both Fortified and Tyrannical active. Now the thing is, even though I find Tyrannical bosses a little annoying, the extra health, the added health is really the annoyance of any sort of like Tyrannical boss. Ultimately, all this really boils down to is that they're just kind of making Mythic Plus hit a little harder, have a little bit more health. So generally speaking, I do think this is better. I think it is certainly a lot better to not have Sanguine and Bolstering and Incorporeal. I think that aspect, that history of the game, we're going to look back on and say, man, all of those affixes that forced you to play the affix instead of the game itself, man, those were such a mistake. And also, I think this really gets rid of push week as a concept, because every week is basically going to be the same. It's either going to be Fortified or Tyrannical, and then Tyrannical or Fortified, and then if you're just doing +10s, it's going to be those, Challenger's Peril and Zalatas Bargain, one of the two. They'll rotate every week, that's about all that changes. But for high-level players, doing push week, pushing their keys, Zalatas Bargain is disabled. It's Zalatas Guile. It's just more pain the whole time. Fortified, Tyrannical, Zalatas Guile, and Challenger's Peril. Just really, really punishing content with absolutely no upside, no reason to do it at all, except that you really want to prove that you are the most punished person on the earth. All right, with that being covered, now let's move on to something a little bit more fun, and that would be some class changes. Now, they started off by just kind of throwing a big blanket nerf to Avoidance and Leech. They feel like the players have too much Avoidance and Leech by the end of the expansion, and they feel basically like the difference between having and not having Avoidance and Leech, since they aren't deterministically acquired on a lot of pieces of gear, the difference between having them and not having them is just so gargantuan that they wanted to just completely cut Avoidance and Leech in half, like straight up. And then basically go through the talent trees of all of the classes where you get Avoidance or Leech in the class tree and just cut that in half. The one thing that escaped was Martial Instincts for monks, and I think the reason for that is because it's a 2-point talent that gives you a whopping 4% total avoidance. I think that was already within their pretty low parameters, like that they're leaving for all of these other classes, so I think that's okay. All right, there were some very small changes, well, not that small changes to Frost DK, but some changes to Frost DK anyway. The Obliteration change they made last week with the rune power cost and the damage, that's been killed off. They gave it 1 week and decided to kill that off. I guess the feedback was pretty negative. And then just a lot of like flat aura damage buffs to Frost DK, as well as sort of tuning down some of their damage during their cooldowns, but then boosting their baseline damage to compensate. I think that kind of makes sense. Demon Hunter still hasn't gotten any class changes, but they have reduced the number of soul fragments required to activate Reaver's Glaive for Vengeance only, down from 40 to 30, so hopefully that'll be a little bit more competitive with Fellscarred. I still don't really think so for Mythic Plus. I think Fellscarred is just so clearly better in sustained AoE damage situations, but, Eldrazi Reaver could at least be good in single target. There's not really much to say about Druid. There was a situation where you could take Improved Stampeding Roar without having Stampeding Roar. This is something that got laughed at a lot, but that has been fixed. Not really all that much to say. Balanced Druid got some insane buffs. May we all be as blessed and as sad as Balanced Druids. All right, now let's move on to the Shadow Pantry for Windwalker and Brewmaster Monk, and just a very small change here. The damage required to accumulate a Flurry Charge has been increased. They're still sticking with attack power as the kind of mechanic that drives Flurry Charge generation, as they say here, but they didn't really like the current state of tuning. Basically, you could walk into combat, throw a Keg Smasher 3 out, and be at 10 full charges of flurry charges. And I think ultimately, like, the way that this talent tree is kind of set up, a lot of these supporting talents are structured, especially things like Wisdom of the Wall. Basically every single time you cast flurry strikes by spending those 400 energy, you need to have 10 flurry charges. If you aren't pulling that off, you're doing something wrong. And so I don't really see turning that knob up on the amount of damage you need to do to generate a flurry charge really doing anything there. There's not really any other sort of gameplay there to be had. So I don't really think that this change means much of anything. Maybe it means you have to do a little bit more damage, but you're going to be trying to do all the damage you possibly can. One other change that happened for Brewmaster Monk occurred right over here. It does make the tree nice and symmetrical, which I'm happy about. If we look at the existing tree, this talent right here, Fundamental Observation, has existed and been largely useless for a really long time. Zen Med has a reduced cooldown, and you can allow enemies to hit you in the face over and over again while channeling your Zen Med, but you can move during it. That should probably just be built into Zen meditation in the first place, just being able to move. So, it does seem like that is finally happening with this change. As you can see in the tooltip there, taking any other action other than movement, great, good. Being hit by a melee attack, don't care that I can't, that's fine. So this is fine, nobody used this talent anyway, and now the tree is symmetrical, I count that as a win. And then we have some changes to Paladin. Lightsmith got a pretty substantial increase to their damage bonus from Sacred Weapon and Sacred Weapon Healing for that matter. Divine Guidance also got a pretty substantial bonus. That is this bonus right here. For each Holy Power ability cast, your next Consecration will deal damage immediately split across all enemies and allies. This is a really cool concept. I really like this a lot. It wasn't necessarily great. I mean, initially when it was put in, it literally did 0 damage at all. It was broken. But even, once it was working, it's not amazing. But the idea of getting a bit of snap threat out of pressing Consecration, you press Consecration and it does not a keg smash's worth of threat, but even just a spinning crane kick's worth of threat, just some amount of immediate snap threat would be nice. And it does seem like that is what they're going for with the design of the talent and then buffing it as well. There've been just some more buffs in general to Lightsmith just to kind of bring it up to be, I mean, personal opinion, I still think it's pretty boring. I don't really think it's super interesting, but it is undeniably very, very strong. And now numerically, I do think it's going to be a pretty competitive talent setup as of this current round of significant buffs. It's going to be really strong, even if it's not super fun. All right, now Templar, on the other hand, got a very small set of changes here, and that is to, let's see, is it this talent right here? Sacrosanct Crusade was redesigned, but not really all that different from the way it worked before. Basically, the way it worked before is when you would cast Eye of Tyr or Wake of Ashes if you're playing Rat, you would get a shield. That's basically all that it really did. Now the way it works is if you cast Eye of Tyr or Wake of Ashes, you get a shield, and then when you cast that Hammer of Light, that follow-up Hammer of Light, you get a pretty significant heal, and it'll be increased by the number of targets you hit, and then it will also give you a shield based on any overhealing from that heal. So you get kind of twice as much healing, so a shield and then a heal, as opposed to just a shield. Ret has gotten a small amount of changes here. They keep going at Ret over and over again after they threw in this wonderful talent all the way down here, Radiant Glory, that gives you the guaranteed when you cast Wake of Ashes, it gives you the guaranteed Wings proc, and it gives you Wings procs periodically when you'll use Holy Power Spenders, but you're not actually capable of pressing Avenging Wrath. You're not actually able to use Wings anymore. You just get it as a passive. And they keep nerfing this talent, Divine Wrath, which gave some extra duration to those Wings procs. It now just doesn't work with it at all, but they did change. Which talent is it? It is this talent over here, the second one, Judge Judy and Executioner. That was changed from being a proc that would occur pretty frequently when you would cast Divine Storm to make your next Templar's Verdict hit 4 targets at 100% damage. As we can see, that's been changed to just work with all Holy Power generating abilities. So generators instead of Divine Storm specifically. This seems okay. Being able to get a 4-target Templar's Verdict in a kind of sustained cleave situation could be really, really good. But, 15% proc chance on your Holy Power generating abilities. I'm not 100% certain on how great that's going to be. It does seem like it's going to be pretty good, though, and with, assuming you're taking Radiant Glory, which maybe they didn't want to make it so that was a 100% guaranteed talent for all Ret Pallies, it still seems like it's pretty good, but with Divine Wrath just not interacting with it at all, basically Ret Pallies do have a free talent available, so they may wind up taking Judge Judy and Executioner. All right, just stopping in on Shaman here, still no changes to the base class, some sort of change to the totemic talent setup, or hero talents, I don't care about that at all. All right, now we're down to Warrior here, and Warrior's actually gotten some pretty nice changes here. First of all, Blood and Thunder has been removed. That is a talent that used to exist over here with Crackling Thunder in a choice node. Crackling Thunder also used to give a pretty significant amount of thunderclap damage, and with all of the other multipliers that were occurring, kind of overlapping with that, it was looking pretty nice. Pretty unfortunate that you kind of felt compelled to have to take Blood and Thunder to get those automatic Rend applications. And that functionality's just been baked directly into Rend. Like if I just click my way down here. Now, when you have Rend learned and you have Thunderclap learned, if you press Thunderclap, it'll apply Rend. Easy peasy. Additionally, Crackling Thunder no longer increases Thunderclap's damage, so that's not really anything that you need to worry about. Getting more radius out of it is actually still pretty good, though. It'll make it so that it's a lot easier to hit large packs of enemies. You're never missing anything with your Thunderclap. Getting a bit more move speed slow is actually pretty good in Mythic Plus 2, so, you know, I don't necessarily think this is like a bad talent, but it's definitely like a situational utility talent now instead of something that you really hated to not have because of all the throughput value that you would have been getting out of it. So those are both really good changes. Additionally, Champion's Might, which is this talent down here below Champion Spear, makes it so that when your Champion Spear is active, your crit damage is increased by 25%. Previously, this was a 25% multiplier. Now it's a 25% additive bonus. Just a little bit smaller. Doesn't really mean all that much functionality-wise. Doesn't really move the needle on anything. At the same time, Piercing challenged this talent over here, which used to make it so your initial damage from Champion Spear would be increased by 50%. That just applies to all of the damage from Spear. And just by looking at the tooltip, you can see that is actually about 50-50 of the damage from Champion Spear. You know, it's pretty good. You actually do get a couple more seconds of Champion Spear out of Champion's Might, so actually more than half of your damage with Champion Spear, if you're taking both of these bottom talents here, actually more than half of your damage is coming out of the damage over time effect from it being active. So this is actually more. You know, previously, if you were taking all of these talents, this would have been something like a 22% damage increase to Champion Spear. Now this is actually a true 50% damage increase. So I do think these are a buff across the board to Champion Spear. And, you know, Champion Spear is like arguably the better talent than Thunderous Roar now that Thunderous Roar doesn't generate rage. But Thunderous Roar also got a bit of a bit of a buff here with Uproar, this talent right here, being a 45-second cooldown reduction. So it's now a baseline 44, or not baseline, but it is a upgraded 45-second cooldown as opposed to the 90-second baseline and 60-second talented cooldown. But with Thunderous Roar, Thunderous Words no longer just permanently increasing your bleed damage, it only increases your bleed damage during the period where Thunderous Roar is active. I still think it's probably the worst talent of these two alternatives down here. And then, you know, regardless of what you're doing, you're always going to be taking Avatar and Unstoppable Force. That's just kind of the approach as a Prot Warrior, as an Arms Warrior, as a Fury Warrior, you're always doing that. Additionally, this talent right here, or this change right here, I should say, Rallying Cry, increasing max health by 10%. This is something that was supposed to be in for Season 3 of Dragonflight. They said it was a change that was made. They never actually made it. It just was a tooltip level change. And it looks like they're maybe finally doing it now in the War Within after only 2 seasons of this change not actually being implemented in Dragonflight. Whoopsie. All right, now there was another really nice change in the Colossus tree for Protection Warrior that I just want to show off here, and that's this talent Colossal Might, which is kind of the main stacking buff of the Colossus tree. It stacks up to 5 times by default, 10 times with Dominance of the Colossus, and it increases the damage of your next Demolish, and you get stacks of it by casting Shield Slam and Execute, or I believe it's Mortal Strike and Execute. Maybe it's Overpower, doesn't matter. In today's update, this was also given the extra line here that Revenge will grant a stack of Colossal Might if it hits 3 or more targets. This makes it significantly easier as a Protection Warrior in AoE situations to be able to continue generating these Colossal Might stacks. It makes it really, really easy to continue stacking that buff up, which is great. That also plays into Dominance of the Colossus, which, as we see here, it says, you know, if you're at max stacks of Colossal Might and you gain another one, you get 2 seconds of Demolish cooldown reduction. This is really, really good. This talent in single target makes it so that instead of that baseline 45-second cooldown, you can get somewhere closer to 35 seconds or so as your average cooldown, which is really great. And this just makes it so that that is consistently available not only in single target, but also in AoE situations as well, which is Really, really nice. Now, there's one other small change for Prot Warrior, and that's in the Mountain Thane tree, I guess technically for both Prot and Fury, and that's this talent right here, Keep Your Feet on the Ground. Instead of giving you a couple % more armor, which is like a total non-factor, it gives you 2% physical damage reduction, and then, it still gives you Thunder Blast, reducing your damage taken by a bit. That physical damage reduction is actually significantly more valuable as a defensive stat than armor, but it doesn't play into armor to the teeth, which, 2% more armor is such a tiny increase to your damage. I honestly think I might rather have the physical damage taken more than like 0.01% more attack power. And then finally, for the hero talents for Warrior, Opportunist gives you a little bit more overpowered damage as arms, not really a big deal. What is a big deal is that Arms and Fury have both gotten a 30% all ability damage increase, which is crazy. Like, Arms and Fury were definitely dragging a bit thus far in the beta. I really enjoyed playing them. Like, I liked the mechanics of them. Hitting a training dummy and not worrying about the damage felt pretty good, but actually going out into the world and hitting monsters as opposed to playing other specs, it felt pretty brutal. I felt like I was dual wielding spaghetti noodles or pillows or whatever as a Fury Warrior. It was terrible. So 30% more damage for both Arms and Fury feels like exactly what the doctor ordered. 20% more overpower damage is pretty nice. And then Fury getting a revert on that anger management nerf last week is also really good. Anger management feels great. Definitely nice to always have that operating at a high level. So I would say in general, with all of these changes, I think I'm pretty happy with, the majority of them. I think the lack of Druid and Demon Hunter changes is concerning. I think the Warrior changes are really good. The Protection Paladin ones are actually kind of concerning as well. In the opposite direction, they are shockingly good. And that is a little worrying. I do kind of feel like this is going to be the Lightsmith Paladin. It's going to be something that kind of spikes and peaks through raid testing and then gets nerfed in half and winds up going limping into the expansion, not looking all that great. So that's a little worrying. Blood DK getting absolutely no changes is a great thing. That's the best possible thing that could happen for Blood DK. And then finally, I just want to close on this change that I've really been wanting for a super, super long time. It was just sort of randomly slipped in here very quietly, and it says it right here. The number of character macro slots has been increased to 30, was 18. And so just to show that off in game here I have the standard macro panel for my character. These are, my character specific macros, the 18 character specific macros that we've had since I don't even know how long, 20 years ago, I guess. And now watch as I scroll my mouse wheel down and reveal 2 more entire lines. I would have liked more. I would have loved to have gotten even one more, go from 18 all the way out to 36. That would have been great, but even just getting another 12 macro slots per character is huge. I have so many characters, so many macros in my general macros tab, as you can see. It's literally full up. Most of these macros are macros that I carried over from characters because 18 wasn't enough to serve each character. And I think this is really great. There have been tons of add-ons made over the years to help deal with the overflow of macros on a character-by-character basis. And, it really is something that should just be supported in the base game, and now it is. And I think that's awesome. So this was a really good weekly update. I'm really happy about it, especially the added macro slots per character. Obviously, that was long overdue. I'm obviously happy about the other stuff too, and I think the Mythic Plus changes are really good for the health of the game, but, the macro change is really, standing out to me. It's something I've wanted for a really long time, and so I'm very happy about it. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. Thanks for watching. Bye.